Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's 6 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us for the Baltimore Region Transit Governance and Funding Study Public Forum. My name is Amy Patine. I'm a principal with Nelson Nygaard, and I'm going to be guiding our discussion over the next hour and a half on this effort. If you go to the next slide, Bethany, we've got a few topics to cover, but first we're going to start with some welcoming remarks from Mike Kelly, who's the Executive Director of the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. So I'll hand it over to Mike.
Great, thank you, Amy. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Kelly, and I am the Executive Director, as Amy said, of the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's forum on behalf of both BMC as well as the Baltimore Regional Transportation Board, which is the metropolitan planning organization responsible for transportation planning in our region. As everyone knows, the focus of tonight's event is the Baltimore Regional Transit Governance and Funding Study that's been underway since January and will wrap up sometime this summer. As many of you may know, this study was undertaken by the BRTB in response to two things. First, to a request from the Central Maryland Regional Transit Planning Commission, who last year created the regional transit plan for our metro area, as well as from interest from state legislators, particularly Delegate Tony Bridges, who sits on BMC's board, who sees this as a great next step to advance transit in our region. The objective of the study is to develop alternatives for how the region might structure, organize, and probably most importantly, fund regional transit services differently, and how we can be more responsive than we currently are to the region's needs. Tonight, we've got members of the consultant team who are going to share details about where we are in this effort, as well as where we're heading and the additional things we're going to cover. And we also have a great panel of national experts who are going to talk about their experiences and share their insight as to what works with regional transit and why. I appreciate everybody's attendance. I appreciate everyone's interest in this effort. And we'll be following up after the meeting with a short survey and a request for your input. Again, thanks to everybody for being here. This should be a really informative evening. This has been a great study to be a part of, and public input like this is what is going to make it a great result in the end. So we really do appreciate people joining us tonight. Amy, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. So tonight's agenda, we're going to cover three main topics. First, we're going to give an overview of the study to date and go through what's been the work that's been done over the last several months and the work that is remaining to be done through the month of June. And then once we go through the overview, then we're going to hand it over to the panel. And as Mike mentioned, we've got a great group of 4 national experts who we've asked to come and provide their insights around governance and funding best practices nationally, as well as apply their thinking and ideas for how things might move forward in the Baltimore region. And then we also want to hear from you. So we've put in some time for public comment, and I'll talk after as we go into the panel about the different ways through the public input methods that you can do to provide comments. So you can text, you can call, or you can send us a message. And then we'll wrap up and let you know next steps in the study. So next, I want to hand it over to Bethany Whitaker, who's a principal with Nelson Nygaard and the project manager on the consultant side for this effort. And she's going to spend the next 20 minutes or so giving you an overview of the study efforts to date and what we're looking to accomplish.
Great. Thank you, Amy. So thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be at this point in the project and looking forward to some interesting conversation, both from the panelists, but also responding to your questions. So as Mike said, what we've been doing is a study that's called the Baltimore Transit Funding and Governance Study. We have 3 main goals, which are 1, to understand the way that governance and funding works currently in the region, then to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of the existing system, and then to identify up to 4 alternative models. So different ways that we can structure or create systems for how we make decisions and how we invest in public transportation services. So we've been working at this since January, as Mike mentioned, and we've taken a handful of steps. The first thing that we did was to look at the history. So really trying to understand how we got to where we are, right? So how did it end up that the state of Maryland runs the transit services in the city of Baltimore, for example? We also looked at the way decisions are currently being made, so the governance structures. We also followed the money a little bit to see how the money flows through the system, where it starts and where it ends up. We also did a peer review where we looked at some other examples of the way that regions organize and structure and fund transit services. And then we are also looking into how different opportunities and ways that we could fund public transportation. And then, of course, as we mentioned, some different ways for how we could structure and organize our governance systems. So in terms of the study, we've been at it for a few months. We've done most of the work, that's sort of the background, the history, the understanding of where we are, how it works, and we've done the work on the peers. And we're just about to look into creating some models and some options for how we could fund and govern transit in the Baltimore region. And so it's a really good time to hear from you and to have some of these discussions as we take this next step into developing some new models. So with that, I wanted to take just a moment and talk about what we mean when we say the word governance and funding. I think most people know what those words mean, or many of us use them. But when somebody asks me, I always find it a little bit like I need to pause a moment and really understand what we're talking about. So in the context of this study, when we talk about governance and we're talking about the way that we govern public transportation systems, we're talking about three things. One is the authority. So what power do you have? What power does an organization have with regard to public transportation? Where did that power come from and who are you responsible to? The second question is really about this responsibility. So if you're responsible for delivering transportation services, who are you responsible to and how do you go about doing that? And then, of course, one of the key pieces of the whole thing is how you make decisions. So how do you share that responsibility? How do you share that authority? And how do you collaborate to make decisions about how you're providing public transportation services? And then, of course, the other piece is about governance. Of course, and when we talk about funding, same kind of questions. So what is the source of the money? Who's providing it? Is that funding source viable? Is it equitable? Who's paying into it? And then what's the link to responsibility? So what are the rules associated with spending the funds? And what are you obligated to do if you accept some of the funds? And then, of course, again, this big question, which is how you make decisions about spending the money. How are those decisions shared? And how is the funding distributed in a way that's both equitable, that aligns with the needs, and creates the kind of transit system and service that the region wants and is looking for. So that's kind of the background. And then moving into the way that things work currently in the Baltimore region. So I'm going to just kind of do a little bit of a primer about how we're talking about public transportation and governance and funding in the Baltimore region. The first thing is, what is the Baltimore region? What does that mean to us? So for purposes of the study, of course, we're talking about Baltimore City and Baltimore County, but also the surrounding counties, Anne Arundel, Carroll, Hartford, Howard, and parts of Queen Anne. I think the alternatives that we're creating could include the entire region or a portion of the region. We're not bound to include this entire region in all of our alternatives. But when we collected data, when we looked at how decisions are currently being made and how funding is being distributed, we considered this entire region. Then in terms of the services that we're talking about three real categories of services. The first are the statewide services, which is really the MARC trains and the commuter buses that connect people to Baltimore City and Washington, D.C. and parts of Maryland to either Baltimore City and Washington, D.C. We're also talking about the Baltimore Link services. Sometimes they're called the core services, but these are the fixed route buses. So the City Link, the Local Link, the Express Link, the light rail system, the subway service, and then the demand response services, which are branded as Mobility Link. We're also talking about the locally operated transit systems. So these are the services that are operated by the municipalities and the counties, so things like the Charm City Circulator in Baltimore, Carroll Transit, Hartford Link. So these services that are operated really at the municipal level and at the county level. So the next slide is going to talk a little bit about the funding. And I think most people know, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page, in the state of Maryland, transportation is funded through what's called the Transportation Trust Fund. So the state of Maryland levies some taxes and some fees and collects that money, puts it in the trust fund, and uses that trust fund to pay for all transportation investments in the state. About 85% of the money comes from these taxes and fees, so gas tax for sure, but also some fees that are on vehicle registration, a portion of the corporate income tax. Some of the money that comes from the federal government is also put in the trust fund, as well as some of the user fees. So some of the fees that people pay when they're using the transportation infrastructure. So a category of that, for example, would be fares paid by people using the transit services. So the Maryland Department of Transportation takes this transportation trust fund, creates one trust fund, one funding pot, and uses it to support all of the transportation investment in the state. So that includes public transportation, of course, but it also includes the airport, the ports, the highway, the Department of Motor Vehicles. All of those services and all of that infrastructure is supported by this trust fund. It's shared across those services. We talk a lot about the Maryland Department of Transportation, then also specifically the Maryland Transit Administration, and the funds that the Maryland Transit Administration uses to support commuter rail, the Baltimore Link services, and then it partially funds the lot services. So in the case of the commuter services, Maryland Department of Transportation both provides the funding for those services and it operates those services through a contract. So they hire a private company to run the buses and the train, but the money still comes from Maryland Department of Transportation. In terms of the Baltimore Link services, those services are both funded and operated by Maryland Department of Transportation. So all the transit operators, the mechanics, the people that work with the system, they're employees of the state of Maryland. In terms of the locally operated transit systems, those systems receive some funds from Maryland Department of Transportation, but they also raise money locally. In terms of making decisions, because the Transportation Trust Fund is collected by the state of Maryland sets the policy and the guidelines for those decisions and that funding distribution. They provide that guidance to the Maryland Department of Transportation, who then works with the Maryland Transit Administration and makes those decisions about the transit investment. Of course, everybody who lives in the state of Maryland, including people who live in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Howard County, and Arundel County, they vote for the governor. The governor appoints a Secretary of Transportation. They also elect state legislators. So that is the body of people who make decisions about how this funding is used and allocated among these services. In terms of the locally operated transit systems, as I mentioned, they get some money from the Transportation Trust Fund from the state, but they also raise money locally. And then again, like the state assembly and the governor, the city and the county set the policy and the overall strategic direction for how the service operates. And then the transit agency staff is responsible for the nuts and bolts of implementing that service, of making those investments and ensuring that the service is successful. So in terms, when we look at the strengths and the weaknesses of the existing system with the Baltimore Link services, they're funded and governed at the state level, so there's some advantages with that. One is that at a local level, there's no additional financial responsibility. So people register their vehicles, they pay the gas tax, but they don't pay any additional funds in order to get public transportation services. But with that lack of financial responsibility, there's also a lack of or limited local and regional input. And then in part because the services are funded and governed separately, there's some limited interaction between both the Baltimore Link services and the lots, but also the local governments. So they operate a little bit separately and there's not as much coordination as we might want. In terms of the lots agency, of course, they have the advantage of having a lot of control over their system, but they have more responsibility for the funding and they face the similar challenges associated with coordination and interaction between the systems. So when you kind of put those things together, the key strength is that there is this financial support, that the state of Maryland is really involved in raising funds and supporting public transportation investment. That funding has largely been stable in the past, and that is a big strength for the system and for the operations. Sorry, you guys, whoops. Sorry about that. And then the weaknesses, of course, are the limited influence over decisions, limited coordination. And then, of course, another big one is the state has this way of raising transportation funding for transportation, and the local agencies have limited ability to raise additional funds. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the peers and some of the examples and lessons that we learned from looking at other places. So when we approached the peer review, we looked at two different types of systems. One are places that are sort of like Baltimore. They're about the same size, have similar demographic characteristics, similar economic situations. And then we also looked at some places that we thought were best practices or offered some lessons and have had some successes in transit governance. So some of the places that we looked at, SEPTA in Philadelphia, Charlotte, North Carolina, and their CAT system, the Utah Transit Authority in Salt Lake City, SMART, which is the suburban counties outside of Detroit in the state of Michigan, and then Metro Transit, which is in St. Louis and also includes some services across the river into Illinois. And then at the same time, we didn't do a deep dive into the Washington area, WMATA services, but we kept our eye on that agency in part because, of course, it's a model for how things could work in the state of Maryland. So some of the things we looked at is these authorities. So what sort of authority did these transit agencies have? Where did it come from? So in most cases, that authority comes from the state who gives them permission, gives them the power to operate public transportation services. In most cases, that power also comes with the ability to raise funds. In terms of responsibilities, transit agencies and transit boards in particular tend to hire and oversee the general manager. They make investments about services, they oversee budgets, they make service changes, and then they make fare changes. In terms of decision making, as I mentioned, in most cases, they have a board or a commission that oversees, does the policy pieces of the transit agency. There's a lot of different ways to doing this. We saw in the peers, some were really small. They only had 3 people. Some were significantly larger with more than 14. Some commissioners are elected, some are appointed, some are staff, some are members of the community, and some are paid and some are unpaid. Representation tends to be tied to contribution levels, and often service investments are tied to contribution levels. So that means so for example, in the case of Southeast Pennsylvania for SEPTA, which includes the city of Philadelphia, it also includes the surrounding communities. If this is not actually the case, but if the city of Philadelphia put in disproportionate amounts of money, they would also get that amount of service in return. And then if they are making more financial contributions, they might get more seats on the board. And so thinking about funding, as we mentioned, federal grants, federal money, there is federal money to support transit. It always requires local governments to provide some money. Many transit agencies rely on state support, but almost all of them also rely on some local funds. And then in terms of local funding, that typically comes from one of 2 places. One is partner contributions. So that could be cities and county governments that make contributions to the transit service. It could also include institutions like hospitals and universities. And then in other cases, transit agencies have what's called dedicated funding, or taxes or fees that are specifically dedicated to the funding and operation of public transportation services. So that's kind of some of the information in the background and that we've been collecting and we've been thinking about. And then in terms of how we're putting it all together is we're looking at the existing systems and the existing services, the way things work in Baltimore region, some of the lessons that we've learned from other regions, a lot of the input and feedback that we've had from stakeholders, and we're asking ourselves how we can change and adjust the way that public transportation is governed and funded in Baltimore region to get better outcomes. And we talk about better outcomes. Some of the things that we're really interested in are things like the ability to improve the quality of public transportation, have more of it, have higher quality transit services, increase coordination between services, but then of course the 2 big ones, which are 1, have more local input into decision making, and have the ability to raise more funds, if that's what the region wants to do. And so with that, I think, Amy, you're gonna turn it over back to you and you can introduce the panelists and we'll hear from them.
Great, thanks, Bethany. So hopefully that study overview gives all of you who are listening in a good understanding of how the Baltimore region transit services are structured and funded today, including strengths and some challenge areas. And so as we look to peers and what opportunities there might be as we develop alternatives moving forward, we're really excited to have our panelists here this evening to help us think through some of these issues and how they might be addressed or improved upon through new governance and funding structures. So I'm going to start with group introductions and go through everyone's brief bios so that you know who's with us tonight. And then from there, we're going to launch into a conversation and again, hopefully get some participation from all of you as well. So I will first start with introductions. And so you know who's here tonight. So I'll start with Diane. So Diane Jones-Allen is Program Director and Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Texas in Arlington. She's also a Principal Landscape Architect with Design Jones, which received the 2016 American Society of Landscape Architects Community Service Award. In 2017, she also participated on the ASLA Blue Ribbon Panel on Climate Change. She serves on the Landscape Architecture Foundation as Vice President of Education, and she is also the author of Lost in the Transit Desert, Race, Transit Access, and Suburban Form, and co-editor of Design as Democracy, Techniques for Collective Creativity. And I know Diane's also a Baltimore native and really excited to be with us here tonight to talk about Baltimore, the Baltimore region. David Bragdon has been at the helm of the Transit Center since 2013, which is a New York City-based civic foundation dedicated to improving public transportation to make cities more just, sustainable, and prosperous. A Transit Center conducts applied research and supports community-based advocacy. I love David's bio. He spent the early part of his career in the maritime and aviation freight industries. In the early 2000s, he was elected to 2 terms as the president of the Metro Council, which is the regional government in Portland, Oregon. And he served in Mayor Bloomberg's office in the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. Transit is his passion and a vocation. He drove a taxi cab for a year, has jump-seated a 747 freighter into a remote airport, in the far eastern steppes of the then USSR. He's ridden a Dutch container ship of the Strait of Malacca, not sure if I'm saying that right, and twice has been allowed to run the engineer's throttle on freight trains. So he likes to move big things. And while he's not a Baltimore native like Diane, he does have a Baltimore connection. His great-great-great-grandparents landed in Baltimore from Ireland in 1826. So welcome, David. Naomi Dorner is the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Nelson Nygaard, and one of our colleagues of Bethany and I. She's a collaborative equity strategist skilled at bringing diverse communities, organizations, and institutions together on core issues. And she has extensive experience working with public sector staff, government agency leaders, elected officials, as well as expertise on the technical aspects of storytelling, policymaking, and planning that enable her to be effective at moving staff, leaders, and stakeholders towards shared vision. She recently served as Seattle's and the nation's first ever transportation equity manager, and is also co-founder and national co-organizer of Mobility for Justice for the Untokening. Welcome, Naomi. And last but not least, Paul Lewis is Vice President of Policy and Finance at the Eno Center for Transportation. In that capacity, he directs Eno's policy research programs, including paper development and event organization. He regularly gives speeches, presentations, and participates in events like these on behalf of Eno to government, industry groups, and various public forums, and is responsible for management of the organization's finances and has helped build Eno's policy program from the ground up, continually looking to seek out emerging and challenging issues. So we're definitely excited he's here to talk about governance and funding. He has led policy projects related to federal policy, transportation planning, and transportation governance, and brings experience in transportation technologies, including automated vehicles, aviation, freight, public transit, pricing, economic development. He has a BS in civil engineering from Ohio Northern University and an MS in transportation from MIT, and has served on the board of Young Professionals in Transportation and on the advisory board for Carnegie Mellon's Future of Work program, and was also a Mass Transit Top 40 Under 40. So thank you, Diane, David, Naomi, and Paul for joining us tonight. We're excited and looking forward to the conversation. So you go to the next slide, Bethany. Just want to make sure that folks know, I can't see what you're seeing, but I'm pretty sure through the public input website, you've got the tools available to you to participate in the conversation, but I'll just leave this up here for a minute. If we're going to be, back one slide, we're going to be having a conversation. I prepared some questions for the panelists, But again, want to build in some time to hear from all of you, to ask questions of the panelists or also of the study project team. We definitely want to hear your input and make sure that we address any ideas or concerns you may have. So if you go back one slide, Bethany, thanks. You can leave a message in the comments box, which I believe is available right in front of you. You can text your thoughts to 032 X032 to 73224, or you can also leave a voicemail at 1-855-925-2801 extension 4606. And Bethany, since you're the host, I just want to confirm if you go under live transcript to just make sure that we are closed captioning the conversation as well.
Yep, I think we are. Yep.
Okay, great. Awesome. All right, so we're going to start the conversation. If our panelists want to turn on their cameras, and maybe we can stop sharing the presentation so we can see everyone's faces. Awesome, thank you. All right, so I'm going to start off with you, David. So you've got lots of experience nationally. I know you're familiar with a lot of transit systems around the country and the world for that matter. So just talking big picture to start, what would you say are some of the principles and practices of good governance? And Bethany talked in general about what governance is. We know this is a kind of a tough topic to unpack, but what are the types of things that you see out there in good governance models that are replicable and we should keep in mind here in the Baltimore region?
Sure. Well, I think the principles are derived from what Bethany talked about in the initial presentation about who are you responsible to in a democratic society? Who are the decision makers and who are they responsible to? I'd say really kind of three basic principles. One is that those who are most affected should be those who govern, and that problems should be solved at a unit of geography where they're most apropos to the people who are being affected. Now, many transit systems have real big disparities in the power structure relative to the customer base. Here in New York, for example, our transit agency board vastly overrepresents the suburbs, vastly underrepresents the city. And there are racial disparities in that, given that suburbs are whiter and the city less white. So there are implications to that. Richmond, for example, down 995 from you, has seats on their board from the surrounding county that doesn't even participate in the transit system. So people outside the system are governing it. Well, so that really violates that principle of that those who are most affected have the most power. You're in Maryland, there's questions there about, kind of what the role of a state legislator from Frostburg or the Eastern Shore, how are they involved really in Baltimore City transit when their constituents don't ride it and so on. Second sort of basic principle is those who pay have a stake, those who pay govern. You have taxes that are collected by the state, but I would assume that there's actually a very large share of those that are collected in the Baltimore metropolitan area. They just be collected by the state. And so there may be a disconnection, again, running the decision-making through the state government, as opposed to a little more local or regional control. And then the third basic principle, and it goes back to that, who are you responsible to, is accountability, clarity about who's making decisions, and electoral consequences and sense of responsibility for that. So the obstacles to overcoming those, or the obstacles actually to achieving those principles, coming from the world of politics myself, as you said, I was president of the Metro Council in Portland. So it's somewhat similar to Mike Kelly's job here, but in Portland, it's an elected position. And it was a constant struggle to get elected officials from the jurisdictions to think beyond their own jurisdictional boundaries and that 4-year electoral cycle. But we were able to make the case that not being confined by those arbitrary boundaries, even though those are your voters, literally, there actually is political benefit to thinking beyond those because your voters actually live their lives regionally. An example would be the Seattle ballot measure for sound transit, which raised money region-wide. And there was some initial thought like, well, then it needs to be spent equally in each of the jurisdictions. But when they actually looked at the function of the transit system, the tunnel in downtown Seattle, that some of the suburban officials pointed to that, oh, well, that's a Seattle project because it's located within the city of Seattle. they could make the case actually the whole system depends on that. And there's employment in that area that really consists of not where people vote, but where they actually work. There was justification for spending it more on the functionality without regard to sort of where voters happen to live, the overall functionality. So sort of overcoming those political jurisdictional parochialisms is really important. In terms of how some of these play out in Maryland, I think the mismatch between who decides and who is affected, vivid example last fall when Governor Hogan proposed huge cuts to MDOT, but disproportional ones to City of Baltimore bus service within the City of Baltimore, while much smaller cuts to suburban rail and even smaller cuts to road widening. Well, if you looked at that logically, you'd say the bus riders, majority Black within the City of Baltimore, high degree of essential riders, and they were still riding transit at the height of the pandemic. Commuter trains, predominantly a white ridership who were all working at home. So looking at any of that logically, you would say, well, you would actually be bolstering the bus service in Baltimore and cutting the other, but that wasn't done. Well, it seems irrational. It is irrational. Nothing's actually irrational. It's rational if you're a Republican governor and you're in charge, and those are the voters that you do and don't care about. I'm just being blunt here in terms of
That's good.
So finally, you want some examples. I think London's a great example. It's very clear, Transport for London, under control of the mayor, and it includes streets, it includes transit, it includes bike share, it includes taxi regulation. Everybody in the City of London knows who's in charge. He or she runs for office based on a transportation platform. If the tube is late, you know who to blame. It's the mayor. If the taxi service is not set, you know who to blame. If there's a pothole, you know who to blame. It's the mayor. Very, very clear accountability, very clear responsibility, and a real contrast to the opacity of our systems here in the US.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And thanks for kicking us off with a lot of great thoughts, gosh, to unpack. And I think, clarity and transparency is certainly, I think, one of the goals of this effort, and helps to create that accountability and coordination between transit and other aspects of the transportation network. And then, there was a question actually that popped up in the chat that somebody had about how the RTAs were formed in the 70s. I don't know if we have time to get into the history, but I will just say during our project study, we did start with a history of how the Baltimore region's transit structure came to be what it is today, with MDOT, MTA, and the state operating those services directly. And it's a really good read. It's a technical memo, but it does get into how it came to be. And to your point, David, a lot of systems around the country, not just in the Baltimore region, political alignments and decision making that comes with that doesn't always align with people's travel needs and how they move about the cabin within a region. So those are really good points. I think a good segue is to go to Naomi next and to talk about the role of equity specifically in good governance and why it's so important to get that right at the outset at a structural level. So Naomi, if you want to share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, great. I thank you so much, David, for setting that up really well, because, in terms of equity, I think it's really important that we not only define equity, right, but that we understand like why equity. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then some of the work that I've had the opportunity to do, and some examples of where I've seen equity in governance really shift, right, performance and outcomes as it relates to, users that are really not only dependent, but essentially what we have learned, right, through the pandemic, if nothing else in our field, is that, essential riders are core riders, and who the core riders are people of color, low-income communities, and they are really keeping our economic vitality and will really be important for the recovery of our systems and cities. But in terms of equity as it relates to governance, I'll just build on some of the principles. I think that we talked about accountability, clarity, so that's like related to direction, really clear as to like what are we looking to do, what are the desired outcomes that we want as it relates to the governance and then the outcomes from the governments. And then also, performance, right? So how are we tracking that performance? What is the transparency of that performance? And then in terms of legitimacy, right? Like legitimacy from the standpoint of accountability. So really, how are we making good on, right, the desired results, specifically that are coming out of communities who are really the core users of our systems, right? The core customers, I guess, is how we define that often. So in terms of the elements, right, I think that there's sort of, in terms of good governance, right, equity is an aspect of that. And there are 3 dimensions to me of that. There's recognition. So that is the acknowledgement of the users' not only rights, but their needs of the system, what their values are, and what ultimately they're looking to see come out of a system, right? So there's recognition. There's procedure as it relates to governance, right? So that is really inclusiveness as it relates to decision making. So that's transparency and accountability in terms of how we're setting and then also meeting goals. And then there's the distributional piece, right? So governance in terms of how we're sharing costs, how we're actually ensuring that the outcomes of the system are distributed equitably. And I'll just harken on this for a second. I think David already touched on this. Equitably and equally are very different. And so ensuring that the distribution is going to where the needs are greatest and where there is not necessarily like higher payments into the system, but where we see like just a density of use and a density of need and a concentrated sort of amount of use. So that is sort of how I think about the dimensions of equity and fairness as it relates to governance. And I guess I'll talk a little bit about some of the work I'm doing. And we've already discussed just nationally, the why in terms of why it's important to think about equity and governance always, but especially now, is how we got here, right? So when we saw the hollowing out of our transit systems, streetcars, I mean, really from that era on into the 70s, right? We're really talking about white flight that was occurring in major cities. And so we saw, I'm currently working on a project in Denver where, we're looking at literally the sort of way that the transit system evolved and transit evolved in that region. And it was very explicitly about, following and chasing essentially white commuters, and it was white flight. So now, the conversation there is how do we prioritize and really reinvest in Denver and the communities, specifically communities of color that are, that are the primary users of the system. So that is really, core to that project. And that work is ongoing, doing that. Similarly, there's a system redesign that's happening with Samstrans here in California, really thinking about, equity within the context of that redesign. So these are conversations that we know are happening, and the reason they're happening is because we have to understand how we got here and then how we want outcomes to be different, and how the governance, right, needs to change. And ultimately that representation matters, and the procedural piece, right, for the systems change to occur really matters as well. So it's really about representation, partnering and understanding what communities' needs are, and then ensuring that that is built into like the procedural changes that then get to sort of your distributional changes and outcomes. So I'll just add this last note because I think it's a really great example. Both David and I believe Diane will appreciate this. I used to live in New Orleans, and I got to see firsthand, really the transformation of the RTA and transit system there, specifically from a governance perspective. And it was, part agitation, and we'll talk about advocates and their role, but I think it was part agitation, right, on the part of advocates, but it was really also incredible to see that through that work and mobilizing and working in and with and in partnership with community, there were real changes that that are being made to the transit system there, and the way that in which the system has been chronically under invested in, and where money was being put into the streetcar was there was no denying that it was really race-based, and it was chasing sort of dollars, in terms of development as well as tourism. So, but kind of going through work over the last several years, really seeing some big changes to not only the leadership, to the board structure, to really partnering with community, understanding what the needs and the outcomes were, that people were really paying high costs. And so those changes are, I think, being slowly incorporated. But anyway, I'll stop there, but I think
Yeah, no,
those are
it's
some
great.
examples.
Yeah, and thank you for laying out some of those principles around equity and how, if you do get that right at the governance level, which can feel mundane maybe in some respects, but how it trickles down into real impacts on people's lives. And I do think New Orleans is a great example of how you can be successful in making some of those structural changes and having it result in a good outcome. And I applaud our client and the team that we're working with with the Baltimore Metropolitan Council and the Baltimore Region Transportation Planning Board for taking on this really big topic. So everyone, I think, in Baltimore is excited about within the project team of what opportunities can come out of potential changes. And so I think that's a good segue to go over to Paul. So Paul's really familiar with issues in Baltimore. Recently put out a study looking at governance, particularly within the Baltimore region, and so he certainly knows the history and structure and challenges here. So kind of building on David and Naomi, what are some of the key good governance principles, Paul, that you see that Baltimore in particular needs to keep in mind, or opportunities that might be there to specifically here in the Baltimore region?
Thank you, Amy, and thanks, David and Naomi, for setting that up. We at our organization did a kind of similar work on looking at the governance in Baltimore, and we talked to a lot of folks, stakeholders, public sector, private sector, community groups, nonprofits, labor unions, etc., trying to figure out what was the issues in terms of governance, and what was causing some of the big problems, and what is practicable. And so some of the things that we outlined in terms of important aspects of what reform might look like. And the first one is that the state in the state of Maryland plays a huge role in governance, and it probably will continue to play a huge role, in part because of the funding that flows through the state. About $800 million from the state goes into the Maryland MTA every year, and that's not something that's easy to replace. And there's also some benefit to having state government involved because they do take a regional approach. But at the same time, the localities and local jurisdictions need to get more involved, and not just Baltimore City, but the other counties around there that also see service. It is a regional system and needs to have regional input and function like that. And that's getting at, too, some of that representation on the board and some of the activities for rider and community participation is one that's really important when we think about governance. Part of that, too, is consistency in leadership. And right now, the governor, through the Secretary of Transportation and the administrator of MTA, has complete authorization and authority over pretty much every single decision that happens at the MTA. And so a new governor can come in, change leadership completely, can change long-term planning. We saw that with the cancellation of the Red Line a few years ago, and that's incredibly disruptive to an agency that's trying to build a long-term system and plan for the future. Other agencies achieve that through some kind of board and have some kind of board terms with both state or local representatives on that. But that consistency to leadership, particularly at a board structure, is really important to those long-term strategic thinking. We also think that the MTA's, no fault of the staff there, but it has a huge mandate. As Bethany mentioned in her presentation, that it's responsible for the statewide services, and frankly, some of those services go into DC and they go into West Virginia and they go beyond state borders, while also controlling the services in and around the city of Baltimore, the core services that she referred to them. And then also the MTA is building a huge capital project in the suburbs of DC and PG and Montgomery counties, all at the same time, all at the same leadership. And those three very distinct functions, I think, are a challenge to manage all at once and do it all well. And so kind of the looking at breaking those up into some distinct operating units is a good approach. And then, of course, when you're thinking about governance, we also need to think about the workforce, right? Workforce is an important constituency. They're an important part of the transit system, and they definitely deserve to be part of the conversation and ensure that some kind of transition is not to undermine workers' rights, one that is really focused on providing better service for everybody. So let me stop there, because I know we're sensitive to the time, but it's one of those things that we're been following really closely.
Yeah, and thanks for providing some of those specifics and kind of reiterating what we've been looking at as we get a handle on current services and structures, because it is a complicated system that evolves out of a long history, and it is a big challenge to meet so many needs across the city, the region, and the state. Just to stay on Baltimore, and obviously it's a public meeting tonight. I'm sure many folks listening in are transit riders themselves. And I'd love for you to share your thoughts on how the current structure today is contributing to some of that inequity in the region that people might be feeling, and your thoughts on how that governance structure kind of translates down into the rider experience and into communities.
Thank you. So, Baltimore is, city, like you showed, it's part of a region, right? And so one of the issues with the way transit operates now and could be better is, to give people greater access to work and services. As people have been shifted from the city to the outer urbs for many reasons, right? Because of development, some or redevelopment or gentrification, I want to say the bad word, or some reasons is because, there are better, cheaper housing or jobs. There's a study that shows that people of lower wage earning people tend to live further away. And we could see that. That was a great point about during COVID, closing lines when you have people, that essential workers that have to go further. So some of the things that happen when you don't have a good service, if that's what you're asking me, are those things that you can't get to work, you can't get, and then there are other forces, right? You can't get to work, you can't get to services, you can't get to your sister who's keeping your kids because you've been vouchered out because of some development that happened in downtown Baltimore. And, so all those things, work together. You increase transit deserts, right? Which are places with limited access and high demand. And we have a lot of those, and those are hard because people in transit deserts tend not to be visible, right? Because the form tends to be more suburban, but there are a lot of people who are transit dependent that are living in the outer urbs of Baltimore for many reasons. And so not having transportation that is equitable, all those things that was just talked about, that serves people no matter where their geographic or social, whether their social or geographic condition, it's going to serve you, equitably, right? And if that's not like at the forefront of service, then you end up with all those things. You end up with people who can't get where they need to get because they live very far, right? And it impacts one's access to work, and also it impacts one's access to housing, because I can't live in that place that might be, unfortunately, the outer urbs might be less expensive than downtown Baltimore, but downtown Baltimore, might have all the transportation, but I've been vouchered out to where there isn't. So those are some of the things on the ground that happen when you don't have equitable governance and equitable service.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are really thorny challenges to address through changes to governance, and to, I guess, add to this. We should spend some time talking about funding as well, because I think you can't talk about governance without talking about funding, which is a real challenge, again, not just in the Baltimore region, but for transit systems across the country. And the need that you talk about, Diane, for improved services, and that others have talked about as well, thinking through decision making is important, but it also any entity needs the resources to make those improvements to service. So I want to switch the topic a little bit and spend some time to talk about potential ideas around funding. So I'll go back to you, David. We've seen a lot of systems around the country have, I guess, negative financial impacts due to COVID and impacts to local revenues. There's also been some successes around the country with innovative transit funding measures. I'd love to hear your thoughts about transit funding measures that you think might be good, equitable solutions here in the region, or just ones that you think have just demonstrated real success, either in how they went about getting them passed or in terms of the results of that new funds to again achieve some of these ends of improved service.
Sure. Well, I'm glad you started with the question of governance. I think all too often the discussion about transportation starts with money and the sort of claim that, well, we just need more money, as if our problems with transportation in this country were lack of money. And in fact, there's lots of money in the transportation system right now. We spend a lot of money on transportation as individuals, as well as governments. And I think it's important, before talking about new money, we got to be frank about the waste of existing money and the irrationality and opacity of the current system of finance, and how inequitable it actually is, and how biased it is toward roads and automobiles in many, many hidden ways. So let's just talk about that for a minute, because those things have to be fixed before we just sort of dump more money into existing formulas. Some of the double standards in it, for example, a trust fund for highways. Now, if you're in the state government, if you're the head of the state parks department, you've got to go to the legislature every year and justify what you're doing and have detailed hearings and describe your successes and failures and ask for the money. If you're the education K through 12 or the university system, same sort of deal. A lot of legislative oversight. The governor's got to put it in his budget or her budget. Well, state highway departments generally do not have to do that. There's just a trust fund that just throws money at them without any measurement for results, without any justification, without any explanation, with very, very little oversight. But while that money is flowing automatically to highways, transit projects often have to be put to a vote. They're debated. People have to justify them. On the federal side, they have to put in competitive grants. There's no entitlement like there is with highways. A lot of federal money flows to localities, but through the hands of the state highway department, that actually has the theoretical ability to flex more funds to non-road uses. But because they're the state highway department, what are they going to spend the money? Well, I have money here. I'm a state highway department. I can either keep it for myself or I can give it to somebody else for transit. Well, the natural human inclination or agency is, I'm going to keep it and do what I do and not pass it through to local government. So all of those biases create all types of of waste and non-strategic spending. It's why we're widening roads in places where the population isn't increasing and where widening roads just makes the traffic worse. So those things need to be fixed before we talk about new revenue. In terms of new revenue, just some basic sort of ideas and principles. There's no magic. Different places are raising them in different ways. The interesting thing is the track record of local ballot measures is quite strong, that transit is a popular thing at the ballot box. In general, we find diverse revenue sources are good. It's good to not be dependent on any one very cyclical source. So here in New York, we're heavily reliant on taxes that are tied to the business cycle. So in times of recession, they're very sensitive to that. And that's true of other places that are tied to, for example, sales tax. Other second point on sales tax tends to be a regressive tax, depending on what is taxed in that jurisdiction. But lower income people pay a higher proportion of sales taxes than means tested taxes like income taxes. And then finally, there's the whole realm of user fee related fees like congestion pricing, which will go into effect in New York here, which not only generate revenue, and London's another example, Stockholm, Singapore, it not only generates revenue for transportation, but also manages capacity and traffic. So those are all good things to look at.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, and good comment about how to look at your overall transportation funding program, and then to think through the sources of those revenues and who they're derived from and how they're applied. Naomi, you mentioned advocates earlier, and the challenge, whether it's redistributing existing funds or getting new funds, often requires advocates and stakeholders getting involved to push for more say in decision making and I think just generally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on advocacy, either as it relates to governance, but also to helping to get increased funding or reprioritize funding for transit improvements, and help us think through maybe what role advocates might be playing here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we started out in terms of governance, really, I think understanding that a part of good governance and equitable governance really is emphasizing, the voices, not only who you serve, but also, bringing those voices into formal decision-making processes, right? And so partnering with community, as well as specifically advocates, human service providers, and really like groups that have their ears and eyes on the ground, and who are comprised often of people who are users of the systems, right, that we are talking about governing and operating. So I think, the reaction is often to, keep advocates out of the room, to keep advocates maybe out of the decision-making processes. But I think the more there are examples, right, where we've seen, especially on the funding front, right, where if we're really clear about the intentions and, again, the direction that we're heading, if we're co-creating that, right, with community needs and community input, then the propensity to obtain funding and the support for the funding that we're seeking is greater, right? The support for that is greater, and just general awareness is greater. I mean, look, engagement is very hard. Agencies have a hard time doing it. So why not have as many partners at the community level and in the advocacy space as possible to really shine a light on the good work that is being done, and where yes, improvements need to be made, and getting their input, right, and that firsthand understanding and knowledge that then can translate into advocating for funding needs. And examples, I think I've already noted the one in New Orleans, but I think a really good one from my time in Seattle, a group called Transportation Choices Coalition, statewide advocacy organization working both at the state legislative level as well as at the local level in different communities, including Seattle. David already mentioned sound transit. There was another ballot measure, at the region and local level. And, it was really the groundwork and a lot of the engagement and education and awareness that the advocates were able to do that the agencies were not necessarily able to do and did not have the relationships necessarily to do. They were able to support and get it done and get the resources and the funding at the local level that was needed. We also saw that in LA with Measure M. There was a huge coalition of advocates that got together that were able to raise an unprecedented amount of money that it was specifically for transportation and housing. So I think there are plenty of examples of when we set the course in our governance to have equitable outcomes, and we create that transparency from the outset and invite people into the process from the governance standpoint, then again, on the flip side, you really it's a winning formula for understanding what the needs are and then getting the funding and support. Not always, but I think it's definitely more successful in terms of a formula than if you don't. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's a nice way to describe sort of the nexus between if the governance is in place with that transparency and broader community engagement in mind, then it does help to, when there are opportunities to make further investments or advocate for further investments, it links that together. I think it's a great point. I'm going to go over to Paul and ask, I guess, a kind of a hard question, but again, knowing the way that transit is governed and funded in Maryland, this as we've gone through this study and talked with stakeholders over the last several months, we have talked a lot about the link between governance and funding. And so I guess I just want to, and you mentioned how big of a role the state plays, and we've been talking a lot about the needs locally. So I guess I'm just going to ask, what are your thoughts about how governance and funding should or could be linked in Baltimore? And do communities, is it a one-to-one? Do you have to pay to have a say, or is there a different way to be thinking about that relationship in the Baltimore region?
It's a great question and something we've spent a lot of time thinking about and exploring, not in this region, but in other regions. And I think, a lot of the challenges with how we fund transportation broadly, the things that David mentioned, definitely stand, right? And those are the current reality and something we've been working on. And the equity components that Naomi just discussed are also kind of part and parcel to all of this. But the bottom line is that in most regions, if you want a seat at the table, you have to bring some money to that table. And from a board representation standpoint, trying to understand how we balance that, right? And in the Baltimore region, the state has such a huge dominant role in funding that, from a practical standpoint, that will likely continue, as will their representation on the board. When we looked at a couple other regions, there tends to be a balance, right? Where localities or local jurisdictions do contribute some in various ways, and then are equally represented on the board in some capacity, right? And we looked at how that works in places like Minneapolis and Pittsburgh, where there is a kind of a balance between the state and local representation. Sometimes that comes from dedicated sales tax revenues. Sometimes that comes from just a local assessment, right? Where localities need to use their own property taxes or whatever tax revenues they need to meet that assessment. Then there's also the fact that if we are to build a regional transit system, you would hope that it absorb a lot of the locally operated transit systems, right? And there's those budgets could be contributing to that local contribution. And one thing that I think is also compelling is the region's toll bridges, or I guess toll tunnels, something that a lot of other regions do. If you look at New York or Boston or the Bay Area, they have toll revenues that are dedicated to transit, and there's some justification for that, right? Due to the noise and air pollution that those vehicles create in urban areas. It's a relatively straightforward way to add a $1 per bridge or per tunnel can raise a substantial amount of revenue. And that could be one way too, where we're able to leverage those assets, similar to what David was talking about with congestion pricing, as a way to augment that local contribution. So there's lots of different ways to do it, and ultimately it's going to be a political decision but it's something the region certainly needs to think about as a region, right, and not individual jurisdictions kind of fending for themselves.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. And then Diane, I'm going to ask you a question of, we talked about some good ideas tonight, and again, what's working elsewhere. If we are successful looking ahead and we come up with some alternatives that hopefully will improve transit services and outcomes in the region, what would that mean for riders or for communities? Like what is the opportunity here before us to be thinking about new governance and funding, or how you approach funding in the Baltimore region, again, to get people excited about what can feel like a dry topic, but really, how does this translate down into what the future could look like?
So one thing is, if we could get to a point to rethink how we actually forecast, transit, how we determine how, where the lines go, where, the stops are, the frequency, right? Because we do it in a way, I think that's not quite really helpful to all this that we're talking about. And I think if we just do it in a more catalytic way, because if we got to a point, what would happen, right? If you increased frequency, right? Then you'd have more people riding. People that probably normally don't ride would ride, right? So if funding was equitable, transit was thought of in a more catalytic way, we had good governance, it would mean that, I could live, in cheaper housing that's probably further out from the city and get to work, right? And, because there would be frequent, because what happens is as you get out further, it gets less frequent, right? And all those choices about, the governance, right, determines, how the formulas they come up with determining where the stops go, which is where transit happens, and, the frequency. So that would, if things changed so that there was more frequency, better connections, right? Because it's and I also think too, if we actually thought about transportation in connection with housing, which we don't. Those two should be connected, even in terms of like the governance, and I don't know how, but those things need to be thought together, right? So in a perfect system, if that's what you're asking me, in Baltimore City, I could live where I wanted, right? Because there would be a bus stop within that quarter mile from me, right? It would be walkable, and I'd have nice streets to walk on and sidewalks, and I could get on a bus and I could get where I need it, because then I could transfer easily from like all those different things you showed. I could transfer, I could live in DC, I could work in DC, right? And live in Baltimore, which is cheaper. And I could live like out in the urbs of Baltimore, but be able to get down to the station in, because I could make the connections and I could get to the MARC train, right? But right now that's very difficult, and that would be
a seamless experience.
Yeah. And all that, like you said, all that stuff that you guys are talking about does impact a person's experience, on the ground, which transit determines where I work and where I live. It just does. And if we could work all this stuff out that you've talked about, then people could have a greater housing employment choice, right? They could have a greater housing and employment choice. So, and I think that's what people want. People want to be able, and that's why in Baltimore, I'll bring up one thing about life in Baltimore on the ground. In Baltimore, they do something called hacking, right? It's what I call, it's pre-Uber. So I actually, because I knew someone who was wonderful and really connected to the streets and got me interviews with some people that do this. And they're doing it in places where there are buses, but they do it because often, they have trouble getting Uber. They don't have credit cards to get Uber. They don't, the buses don't come frequently enough. So people put their lives in their hands and get into cars with strangers, because, and if our system was better, we would, people wouldn't have to do that, right? And they could be safer and they could, get around on the system, as was just mentioned, that they pay for, right? They help pay for this. Anyway, let me get off my soapbox.
No, that's great. That's great. I like your positive vision of the future. I'm gonna pause there and pivot over to some public comments and questions. We've got one that was just shared with me, and it is, let me see here. While things are changing with toll roads, what is the justification of having free use of roadways and charging fares for transit? Is there any viable movement to make transit rides free, like roads are? I don't know who might want to tackle that. I know, Paul, you mentioned
Yeah,
tolls. Yeah.
I'll jump in on that one. I think that there's movement in both direction, although it's a little tepid, but we are seeing congestion pricing and hopefully implemented in New York sometime, and that dedicated to transit. And so there is some movement in that direction. And there's other regions, cities that are talking about it. And one of them that we've been tracking closely is Los Angeles. It's the biggest region that's thinking about both of this. They want to make transit free, and to pay for that, they want to charge cars for some kind of congestion or cordon pricing. And so it's a really interesting concept, and the CEO out there of LA Metro, Phil Washington, is very much behind this. But yeah, it's I think a very valid idea, but it's going to take a pretty monumental effort.
I just wanted to add to that, because I was having this conversation because I had General Motors come and present to my class. And so, and the city kept saying this stuff about how, we don't want to, the city I live in, Arlington, Texas, where I am, they have no public transportation, none. And so, none, they have VIA. But anyway, so there was this discussion about the same thing. And the illusion is that people who ride cars aren't being subsidized. I'm being subsidized every time I get in my car, from the time I leave my door, because the roads, the stoplights, that's all part of a system that we pay for, our taxes, so car drivers are continually being subsidized. There's just this illusion that transit riders are being subsidized. Why should we subsidize, these people? And car drivers are, this illusion of the automobile, which is not true. It's not, it's nothing auto about it. It's a system, and we pay for the system, and we are subsidized. And so I think, that the start of what you're saying is about getting people to face reality about driving a car. You're subsidized from the minute you get in your car to get where you get. Somebody's paying for that road and those stoplights, so you don't get, in an accident and everything else. So there's just an illusion about, transit is subsidized. We pay those, so some cities don't have transportation because they don't want to pay for it, but yet they pay for cars. We pay for drivers and much more, every day, every minute. Sorry.
That's great.
Well, we have certainly, yes, motorists should pay more. They're greatly subsidized in a number of ways right now. We have an opinion on the fare of transit. Our surveys of riders, including low-income riders, the obstacle to using transit in this country predominantly is not the fare, it's the absence or inadequacy of the service. And when asked, that it's the fact that the bus doesn't come. It's not that the bus costs $1.50 to ride for most people. It's the fact that it doesn't run on Sunday or doesn't run in the evening. There are certainly targeted fare relief programs that you can help to subsidize the fare for those people for whom the $1.50 or the $2 is an issue, and you can target that. But it really makes no sense in terms of prioritization to spend money making transit fareless if it's still of low quality, because people won't ride it even if it's free, if it's not getting them there. So, in terms of Los Angeles, they need to be spending money to improve the bus service rather than spending money to eliminate fares, because the fare is not the obstacle for most people.
Yeah, it's a great point, David. Bethany, this one might be for us on the project team. Why weren't any systems outside the US, like Transport for London, looked at as part of this study? So I think it's part of the peer review.
Right. That's a good question. We didn't look at international systems. It's true. We really focused on, and I think part of the reason is that, yeah, and maybe we should have, but we were trying to understand how systems work within the confines of the way that government works in the United States and the ways that transportation systems are funded. So maybe not a very satisfying answer, but that we didn't look at Transport London, and we did try to stick with, in fact, the United systems within the United States. We didn't even look at Canada. We thought about it, but we didn't do it.
Yeah, and I think we heard some of the comments earlier tonight about the political nature of a lot of this, and I think wanting to look at agencies that maybe were within that U.S. political structure might have a little bit more of that similarity.
Exactly.
I'm going to go back and read the question from earlier. I referenced it, but for any transit history buffs, I could take a stab, but I would be happy to defer to any of you. It seems like many RTAs were formed in the 70s, and there have not been many since then. What happened in the 70s that made that happen, and why hasn't it happened as much recently? Why you're not seeing new transit services pop up and more this kind of legacy and evolving of systems from a long time ago. I don't know if we have Fred Fravel on the line. He was
Wow.
Fred, are you here? No, he's not here. Go ahead, David.
Well, there's an overall shift in the 1950s and 1960s during which transit systems that had been privately owned and operated were going bankrupt and shifted into public ownership. That also coincided with white flight, suburbanization, and so the creation of new mechanisms. So, and then once a transition like that happens in the public sector, usually then it stays the way it is, frozen in amber for decades, and that's basically what's happened in most places. So there is a period of institutional innovation in the 60s and 70s that really hasn't been reproduced since then.
But it is a good question, though, right? Because I think we are starting to think more regionally, and some of the things like, is a region more important than the state, for example, and that a city in of itself is not the end all, the be all, and that we do really operate economically and socially as a region. And so it's a good question why we haven't moved more towards those types of models for things like transportation, but also other systems. We've really stuck in those other jurisdictional structures that we've had for a long time.
Yeah, MPOs were created about in that same period in the 1960s, but some are stronger than others, and some depends on the context and the state, and many of them have governance structures that are out of whack with where the population is. A lot, and also some of this, was rooted in an era where inner city population was declining and suburbs were booming. In many places now, it's the reverse.
I was just going to offer up that in some of the research we did with Denver and some of the other sort of transit systems, we have found that the suburbanization that was happening, the rapid suburbanization and sort of rapid disinvestment from cities and decline in cities at that time, coupled with there was also, there was an oil crisis, and so there was an increase in people needing and wanting to take transit and needing alternative transportation choices. And so all of those things combined really, I think, helped to set up these sort of like regional entities to really take over these ailing systems and systems that were growing to serve a sprawling population. But that was just some of the stuff that we uncovered.
Yep. And just to note, MDOT and MDOT-MTA were both created in 1970. So yeah, followed that similar pattern. I don't see any more questions coming through this chat here. I'm just going to ask Don if I have missed any questions that may have come through from the public.
I just wanted to point out that there's quite a bit of lag going on between the questions coming in and the responses. So there have been a lot of comments. There's been a lot of people talking back and forth. It's kind of interesting to see. It's a new system for us. We're trying to reach out in a new and better way, especially given COVID, to folks. And I hope this is working. We did just get a question. How should we balance transit's urban dense efficiency where it originally evolved and the increasing need for transit to serve suburban low density communities that have growing transit dependent populations? So it's kind of a service question, I suppose. I don't know if anyone wants to take that.
Yeah, or maybe through the lens of how governance or structuring your governance might help kind of hit on those two needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can maybe start a conversation and see if anybody wants to chime in. Just basically what we've seen in the Baltimore region right now is that the suburbs are trying to solve the problem on their own. And the governance structure that we have, where the state of Maryland, the Department of Transportation, is planning the services based on a system that they give some money to the suburbs and the cities to operate their own service, and then they're separately funding a set of services that are oriented around the city of Baltimore. That doesn't really create the structure or the systems that would solve that problem, and how you balance the connectivity between suburbs, people who want to travel from one part of the suburbs to the other part of the suburbs, or from the suburbs into the city of Baltimore, or maybe into Annapolis, or maybe make a couple of different trips. That the way that the funding flows and the way that the decisions are made, that it doesn't really create that innovation. And I think that's one of the things that we're really trying to understand and solve.
Well, I think it's got to be based in the allocation of service is such a key issue, and often it's done without any consciousness, and is done according to sort of who has political power or some formulaic sort of way. We would suggest it should be more about propensity and productivity and impact, particularly based in part on needs and who's going to use the service. Now, the argument like, well, we all pay taxes throughout the region, we should all have the same level of service, really doesn't hold up in that propensity to actually use the service, need the service, is not uniform across the country. And everybody in the United States pays taxes, but we don't have a lot of Coast Guard stations in Nebraska, nor do we have a lot of agricultural subsidies in Manhattan. There is context to these. They're not just services that are spread evenly everywhere. So in terms of transit propensity, there's certain demographic factors in terms of income. There's certain land use factors that, jurisdictions that are zoned for dense development, those are more transit supportive. Jurisdictions that have chosen to have sidewalks and they have created a successful an environment where transit is likely to be more successful. So I think there has to be a connection between sort of land use planning and a jurisdiction's density and as well as the characteristics of the population who live there in terms of need for mobility, non-auto mobility, that help to drive those decisions about how service gets allocated. Equities.
Yeah. Sorry, David. I was just gonna add on to that. I think that, like, going back to David's original statement in terms of governance and clarity, right, around the direction that we're heading. I think for a long time, again, these systems, our systems, right, transportation systems and transit systems were created to chase ridership, right? And I think a reorientation around what is success in terms of service. I think more folks are really thinking about what it means to have, as Diane was talking about, right, access to opportunity and who has access to the opportunity and where the opportunities are, and really, being able to be somewhat dynamic in how we are assessing, right, like service needs as it relates to where people with the greatest needs are and where they are looking to go or where they need to go. So I do think that it is tied to the clarity of, like, what are we trying to achieve? Because if it's ridership, then that's, one set of objectives, and it'll get us, it's kind of why we're having this conversation. But if it's, really optimizing the system for people with greatest needs, and I think that's a different objective from an equity perspective.
Yeah, That's great. Don, I know we have the lag, so I'll defer to you if you see any other questions coming through from the public.
Nothing here.
Okay. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, which I think has got us on schedule. I know we don't have much time left, but if there's anything we forgot to cover, anything burning that you want to share or advice for the project team, I'll just give one more chance in case anyone feels like they want to share anything else this evening. Okay.
I just want to echo
Yeah.
something Naomi said, and I think shouldn't be overlooked. It was a really important point she made about the role of advocacy, this way back in the early part of the discussion, that civic advocacy is the antidote to a lot of the irrationality and unaccountability of our governance systems. And again, example from your area, when Governor Hogan tried to cut the bus service in Baltimore, because those are the political imperatives that he responds to in the position he's in the political party he's in. The reaction was across the board. It's the greater Baltimore Council. It was labor unions. It was Baykeepers, Sierra Club, across the board. All of it kind of under the umbrella of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance and Brian O'Malley and Danielle Sweeney, kind of organizing this letter and really pushing back on it. So the irrationality or apparent irrationalities in the political system can be countered with strong civic advocacy.
Yeah, those checks and balances. And good advice for us to be thinking holistically as we move forward in developing alternatives and working with our partners here in Baltimore on new ideas for the future for governance and funding. Thank you to the panel so much for spending your time with us this evening and sharing your thoughts. It's really much appreciated and has given us a ton of food for thought as we move forward in the process. And I'm excited that we're having this forum and hearing your thoughts tonight, because we are hitting this critical point in our effort. And so with that, if Bethany, you want to share your screen again, we can kind of remind everyone where we are in the schedule and one more opportunity that we are going to be coming back to the public to report out on these recommendations that are going to be coming as part of the study. So
give me 1 second.
Yep.
There you go.
Great. If you go, yeah, next slide. So do you want to talk about next steps, Bethany?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, sorry, I can't remember. I remember who was doing what.
We're going to have our 4 potential options, or at least 4 potential options, ready to share with the community again in June. And so we're proposing to hold another public forum. It will be a virtual open house like this one. We may have a slightly different format or structure, but that will be on June 29th. We will confirm the time with you all, but we would love to have you come back and participate in that and tell us what you think of the things that we come up with.
Great. And if you just go to the next slide, the conversation does not have to end this evening, and we realize we covered a lot. If you go to the following address, you can take our survey. We've also collected the emails for everyone who attended tonight, and so we will be sending out links to both the survey and other ways that you can leave us your thoughts. As Bethany said, we're going to be developing alternatives over the next few weeks, and we'll be continuing to monitor public feedback as it comes in, and take some time on the website of the BMC website. You can see our study materials, read technical memos, and view past presentations to the BRTB board. So again, a lot to digest, but we really do welcome thoughts, ideas, comments, and impacts of what these changes might mean for those of you who utilize transit services or live in the region and are interested in this topic. So with that, I think we are we'll conclude our public forum. And again, thank you to everyone who took the time to be with us tonight, and hopefully we'll see you soon in a few weeks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.